Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the great prebiotic microbiome stool test extravaganza of 2022. This time I am pleased to bring to you data about everybody's favorite PHGG. OMG, PHGG, am I right? I will preface this video by sharing that this data set has inspired me to completely revamp this experiment. And I'm going to be most likely redoing glucomannan and PHGG sometime in 2023. I'll share a little bit more about that at the end of the video, but I know you guys are just dying to get to the data first, so we'll go over the data that I collected first. Then I'm going to talk about the redesign I'm going to do and why that might be. And you'll see that there's some very peculiar and surprising things in this data set, and that's what inspired me to do a redo, basically. But I collected this data. Let's talk about it. First, let me give myself a little head bubble here. First, for those of you who maybe don't know and you're new to the channel, first of all, welcome. Second of all, go check out the other videos. But in this experiment, what I'm doing is I am doing stool testing on myself. Basically, I'm doing 2 weeks of a baseline period where I'm doing no prebiotic supplements, collecting data at the end of that. Then I'm doing 2 weeks of, in this case, PHGG. And at the very tail end of the 2-week intervention period, that's where I'm doing more stool testing. Then I'm doing no prebiotics. So it's another washout period for another 2 weeks. And then I'm collecting data again at the end of that 2-week period. Now, stool testing is intrinsically imperfect, and it's a little bit complicated to interpret because our microbiome is ebbing and flowing and shifting every single day. So in this case, I'm trying to determine what is actually significant. Like, what numbers should we pay attention to? Because the numbers are going up, down, all over the place in this experiment. So what I've done here is I've given you what is a pretty typical bell curve. And the way that I am trying to assess what is statistically significant, acknowledging this is not how they do it in research studies. They would use something called a p-value. But what I'm doing in this experiment here, how I'm choosing to keep it simple, is with a standard deviation analysis. So if you look here, let's say that these are all different data points for my stool tests. And the mean, the 50th percentile, right down the middle of the bell curve, would be represented by the red line. And then one standard deviation would be the green line on either side. And you can tell if you look at this, most of the data points are going to be between those two green lines, right? So one standard deviation on either side of the mean makes up a pretty fair whack of samples. Then if you get down here to the blue lines on either side, that is 2 standard deviations away from the mean. And that is what I'm choosing, at least, to determine what is clinically relevant. So if the numbers change and it changes so much that it falls outside of that 2 standard deviation zone, I'm paying attention to it and I'm saying, hey, that's worthy of us paying attention to and talking about. So that's a little quick once over of the math. But let's come over here. So you can see here we've got the phylum level data. So these are big, broad categories that make up the different bacteria. So we're going to interpret the data in multiple different layers. The first layer is really broad, it's really big, and these are called the phylum. So you can see here, there are 2 that were pretty significant, but I'm not going to talk about them here because we're going to talk about them in the genus and species level respectively. So actinobacteria was one of them right here. Actinobacteria basically is bifidobacteria. So I'm going to talk about them at the genus level in a minute. Vermiculobiota is Acromancia Mucinophilia, so we're going to talk about that when we get to the species level data. So I'm not going to talk about them here. What I'm really looking for here with this data set is whether or not there was a great shift in Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, and Proteobacteria. And as you can see, there was not. So for me, my baseline average was about 44% for Firmicutes. And then it went up to 47% after doing PHGG. And then after the washout period, it went down to 46%. So you would think, oh, it went up a little bit and then it came back down to what your normal was. Maybe that's significant. But if you look at the span in this column here, the 2 standard deviations, 2 standard deviations for my Firmicutes is 14 points. So a little piddly change of 2 points on either side, not significant. Similarly, we could see Bacteroidetes went from 45 to 47 and then back down to 43. None of that was significant. It is not uncommon for my Bacteroidetes to shift quite a bit. So I deem that not actionable at this time. Similarly, proteobacteria really didn't change a heck of a lot, so I'm going to leave them be too. So at the phylum level, I did not see tremendous changes with PHGG. Now, getting into the genus level, so these are smaller categories. They make up fewer bacteria in each category, but we could get a little bit more nuanced about what these guys are doing, if they're good, if they're bad, if they're medium. The first one that I thought was significant enough to mention was Prevotella. Now, I will say, let's pause here for a moment and just appreciate what a weirdo I am. I, for some reason, have both Prevotella and Bacteroides in all of my samples, and they're fairly evenly matched. That is super weird and super uncommon. These guys usually compete with each other. So usually you would get a predominance of one or the other. If you were born and initially grew up in a developing country, you would tend to have Prevotella predominate. And if you grew up in a so-called developed country, usually you would have exclusively Bacteroides. So this is very surprising. And I have seen that clinically with patients. I've worked with people who were born in India and they grew up in India, but they came to the States later on in their life. And they almost always have had Prevotella as their basis. And then virtually everybody I've worked with who was born and raised in the United States has had Bacteroides. So I have seen that pan out to be true. It's not just something they say in research. But if you look at mine, I have both. So that's very peculiar, but we're going to run with it. You can see that my Prevotella went from a baseline of 9.7 up to 16. The difference between the two of those being about 6 points. And you can see the standard deviation for my Prevotella is about 3.7. Or I'm sorry, two standard deviations is about 3.7. So 6.4 is definitely significant for my Prevotella to go up that much. Now, if you look on the other end, not as much so. So it went from 16 down to 12, which feels pretty relevant. It was a difference of about 4. And if we use this previous standard deviation, then it would have been significant. But if you look here, two standard deviations ends up being 24. So if we come over here to the genus level, we come over here to Prevotella in this first row, and we look. So the individual samples now we're looking at. So one day I was 11, 8.8, 8.4. Then during or after the intervention, I was 17, 16, 14. All right, those are all pretty tight. Then look over here. I go all over the place with these Prevotella. 30, 9, 5, 4. So that's why there's a really huge span. And so it doesn't look super clinically significant on the back end of this. I still think it is, but that was really fascinating that there was such a huge span on the third chunk of data there. Moving on. This is one of the bacteria that is inspiring me to scrap the project and totally do a redo. So if you look at this, my bifidobacteria at baseline were 3.16, which is really stinking good. But if you remember, we had a weird thing that happened with the glucomannan video. I did not see any positive change in bifidobacteria during the intervention, but then 2 weeks later, after I discontinued the glucomannan, they shot up to 3 point something. So remember, this baseline is actually the washout period from the last study I did. So I think this is artificially elevated because of the glucomannan that I had been on previously. So it's not really a true baseline, unfortunately. My normal tended to be somewhere below 1% for bifido. But looking at this, it gets complicated to interpret this. My bifido went from 3 point something down to 0.4, which looks really terrible. And you might be tempted to say, oh my God, PHGG suppressed the bifido. I don't think that's what happened. I think that this number was artificially elevated, and then I came back down to my normal range. Then if you look over here on this end, so at the back end of PHGG, I was at 0.43, and then look, it shot back up to 3.57. And what's really peculiar, if you come over here down to the genus level data again, we have bifido over here. Look at some of the numbers, 1.9, 4.0, 3.5. All right, that's a pretty significant span. After PHGG, 0.17, 0.09, 1.03. All right, all those are fairly tight together. Then look at here, 0.5, 0.6, 9.9, which is real high, and 3.1. So I don't know what the devil's going on with those bifido guys. And this is where, here, I'll pull you off the screen share for a second. This is why I've decided to scrap the project and do a redo, because I think 2 weeks might not be long enough. Maybe it takes my bifido a long time to see a boost in their numbers. Maybe 2 weeks is not a long enough time to reflect the feeding that I'm doing for those good guys. So that's one reason why I've decided to redo the project. So what I'm going to do instead of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, which frankly, honestly, has been really hard on my digestive system. I thought because I'm like normal and good now, and I healed my IBS and my microbiome's good now, I thought, oh, I could just give my microbiome whiplash every 2 weeks and it'll be totally fine. No. No, my gut has not been super happy with this project. So, A, to be more kind to myself, and B, because I think that the data quality will be better, I've decided to elongate the process now, where I'm going to do a month of the prebiotic, and then a month of washout period, and then a month of the new prebiotic, and then a month of washout data. The bummer is I have to be patient, and I can't do a video every month now. It's going to have to be like every 2 to 3 months I'm doing a video. But I think that we're going to get better quality data collection. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sample throughout the month. So I think during this time, I'm going to normally do 1 sample every week, or maybe 2. I haven't decided yet. I'm going to do a sample every week throughout that process, because I'm looking for like linear ebbs and flows in the data. I'm hoping I can see that. Then at the tail end of the intervention period and the tail end of the washout period, I'm going to do what I've been doing. I'm going to take like 3 or 4 different samples. And I think that the addition of the weekly samples in between and the elongated collection period, I think that everything I just said will really help increase the quality of the data. But let's go back over here. So honest to God, I don't know what to make of bifido. When this pattern happened with glucomannan, I kind of wrote it off as a fluke. And I remember in the video talking about, I don't know, I had some red wine like 6 days prior. Maybe that's feeding my bifido. But now I'm really beginning to think that it just takes my bifido that long to show the effect from the prebiotic. So these guys have inspired me to redo the experiment. On the plus side, I did not know I was capable of 9 point something. That is freaking stupendous, and it's really exciting because I've had a lot of antibiotics in my lifetime, and I always thought that my bifido were kind of doomed, and clearly they're not. And I will say too, PHGG is known for feeding bifido. Like, it's one of the known talents of this particular prebiotic. So that's part of why too, I really think that this is a delayed, thing that we're seeing here. And I'm actually feeding them with the PHGG, but it just took that long to come around and show it on the data. So that's the story of bifido. Then we've got Lactobacillus. You could see here, so it went from 0.42 down to 0.16. So again, it looks like a nosedive, but again, I think that this might have been artificially inflated because I only had done a 2-week washout period between my other prebiotic and this one. So I'm really not sure what to make of that. But it does look like it was close to being significant by my criteria, at least. And then on the back end, it went from 0.16 down to 0.2 or 0.21. So it actually increased a little bit in the post-intervention phase, similar to the bifido, which again makes me think that we were feeding them. It just took a while for them to log online. And I will say PHGG should theoretically, based on what I have read and I have understood, PHGG should also feed lacto. So I think my theory that this is a delayed response makes more sense than this looking like we were suppressing them. Then we get into the butyrate producers. So these are some of the stars of the show. It looks like anaerostipes didn't love PHGG for whatever reason. I don't know really what to make of that, but it certainly looks like it went down and then it came back up in the washout period. So I think that anaerostipes might not like it for whatever reason. And that's not necessarily intrinsically a horrible thing, right? Like it's just, you feed some guys and not the others. Ruminococcus seemed to like it. It went from 6.4 to 9.9, and you could see the difference there is 3.5, which is definitely bigger than the 2 standard deviation mark that I'm giving you. So that looked significant. And then similarly, it went from 9.9 down to 6.1 on the back end of the experiment. So I do think Ruminococcus really liked it in that case. And you can see that there are some changes in the other butyrate producers. They just weren't as statistically significant. So like Roseburia went from 3 to 4. Faecalibacterium went from 8 to 13, although that looks like that could be within the realm of normal for me. We've got a couple of them that are moving around. They're just not quite as profound of a shift. And then you can see here too, my baseline for my total butyrate producer cohort was 28, and then it went up to 35 after PHGG. So that is a nice little bump. Again, it looks like that amount of noise in the data isn't out of the realm of possibilities for me and my sampling. So I didn't bold it because it's not as significant. But from 28 to 35, I would take that. I think that's really great. And then similarly, you could see on the back end, it went from 35 down to 29. So I think that pattern makes sense. And it does seem like the butyrate producers really like the PHGG. So I'm going to take it. Then you will notice, if you've been with me for a while and you saw the other video on glucomannan, you'll notice I added a few fellas to the data collection. I recently discovered that these are reported on Ombre. Well, I kind of knew, actually. I've known. I didn't think to add them, honestly, because they're not overgrown for me. But I decided to add Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Enterobacter, Proteus, and Streptococcus. None of those were really shifting around a ton. It goes to show you that you can have a healthy gut and you could still have a little teeny tiny amount of bad guys though. So keep that in mind when you see your own stool testing and don't panic completely. But you could see probably the reason why you're watching this video is to know these two numbers. And I was very pleased with them. So my disulfovibrio, this is a hydrogen sulfide producer, one of the biggies. My disulfovibrio went from 0.54 or 0.55 if you're rounding, down to 0.32, which is excellent. And you could see that that was indeed a bigger swing than the 2 standard deviations would lead us to believe. And you could see on the back end, it came back up a little bit. So it went from 0.32 up to 0.45. So that looked, again, like the pattern that I would expect to see. And Methanobrevibacter is the methane producer. This is the archaea that everybody loves to hate. And you could see that my baseline was 0.07, and I went down to 0.02. So I went down by about 60-ish%, something like that. And that looks like it was significant. And then you could see on the back end, when I discontinued, I went from 0.02 up to 0.09. So it came back up after the intervention had ended, which again, you would expect to see, you would think. This is also confusing. But that's the pattern I've been expecting to see all along, is like something goes down and then it rebounds in the washout period, or it goes up and then it comes back down to normal in the washout period. So there you have it at the genus level. So my Prevotella, for me personally, love this stuff. Bifido and Lactobacillus appeared to really like PHGG, although I think it's a delayed response for both of them. Ruminococcus really seemed to like it. Butyrate producers in their totality seemed to like it, although anaerostipes maybe did not. And then it did indeed suppress my hydrogen sulfide and methane producers respectively. So those were really good to see. And then last but not least, let's talk about the species. I'm going to move my little head bubble. And we had a lot of activity at the species level here too. So Faecalibacterium prosnitzii, did go up during the intervention. So we went from 8.2 to 13.05. That's a difference of about 5 points. And you can see my standard deviation score here is 6. So it's pretty close. It's not quite meeting the criteria that I set forth to measure this by, but I still thought it was relevant because honestly, a 5-point swing for Faecalibacterium, like clinically, from somebody who's seen a lot of stool tests and knows this stuff, I think that is significant. Even if my little statistical way of measuring statistical significance, even if that did not seem to be the case. So I'm going to tell you, I think that is significant. Acromancia Mucinophilia, again, I said that I would mention this, started out at 4.49. Now, again, like Bifido, this had a delayed response with glucomannan, and I think this is artificially inflated from glucomannan. My normal, if I remember correctly, seems to be more in the 2 to 3% range. So you can see it went from 4.4 down to, down to 2.14, which looks atrocious, but I don't think it really is. And then interestingly enough, then we see it go from 2.14 up to 4.4 again in the washout period. Now, again, interestingly, 2 standard deviations is 6.9 apparently for Acromancia for me on this back end. So I don't know if that's truly significant, but it looks like it is. And again, I'm suspicious that it's a delayed response similar to what we saw with Bifido, although I don't know yet. This is why I want to repeat the experiment, because I really want to make sense of what we're seeing here. Then we could see Eubacterium rectale. This is one particular butyrate producer, and it looks like it went down during the intervention, and then it came up after the intervention was over, although not all the way up. Interesting. I don't really know what to make of that. I don't know if it's a delayed response again, or if that's maybe a bad thing for Eubacterium rectale, but I thought that was fascinating. Bacteroides vulgaris. This is a bad guy that we don't want to see in an overabundance. It went from a baseline of 15 down to 8.5. You can see that's pretty close to the 2 standard deviation mark. So I think that's pretty significant. And then you could see it actually stayed steady at about 8.5 or 8.3 after the study was over. Bacteroides dorii, I'm very interested to track this guy because I don't have an overgrowth of it, but there was one paper in, I think, Swedish children that showed that this bacteria seems to predominate the microbiome shortly prior to autoimmune type 1 diabetes development, which I found very fascinating. We don't really have a lot of other research on this particular bacteria, but I found that very intriguing. And I'm kind of always looking out for things that might lower this guy, just if I do see it overgrown. And you can see I went from 0.06 to 0.03, so basically cut the number by half. And then you could see that effect lingered in the post-intervention phase of the study. So that was kind of neat. And then last but not least, the Prevotella that I'm hanging around with, this is my Prevotella buddy, again, went from 9.2 up to 15, and then it went from 15 back down to 10 in the latter half of the study. And you'll notice, not coincidentally, if we go back up here to the genus level, that is basically almost perfectly matching the genus level data. So the vast, vast, vast majority of the Prevotella I have is that particular species. So, summary time. I think we showed here that PHGG does decrease hydrogen sulfide and methane producers really nicely. It seemed to increase my butyrate producers, which I was delighted to see. I don't know what to make of the patterns with Acromancia and Bifidobacterium and Lactobacilli, but I strongly suspect that they did like the PHGG, and it's just a delayed response for some reason that we were seeing. And then for me personally, my species of Prevotella seem to really like the stuff. And generally Prevotella are pretty friendly little guys. So I'm not too worried about him. I think that they're generally a good enough group of bugs that I'm excited that I was able to feed it. Like I said, in future versions of the study, I'm going to kind of draw it out so it's quite a bit longer, and I think we can get more clear data. Last but not least, I will share my personal experience taking PHGG. Keep in mind, I don't have anything really clinically that I'm working on right now. I'm pretty healthy. My microbiome is pretty healthy when I'm not messing with it with this experiment. I shared in the glucomannan video that I really loved taking glucomannan because I had like hefty, smooth sausage, beautiful poops, like poops of envy when I was on glucomannan. PHGG, I did not like personally. Like, I'm already kind of cringing thinking about repeating this particular experiment, and I might have to have somebody else do it for me because my body didn't really love it. I tend to be slightly constipated as a norm. Like, most days I have a good poop and it's not anything to write home about, but you know, a time or two a week, or if I'm traveling or something, my tendency is to gravitate more towards constipation. So I was excited to try both of these because both of these have been helpful for constipation before. And like I said, glucomannan was incredibly helpful for that. I was having big, fluffy, smooth sausage poops the entire time I did glucomannan. PHGG, I personally found that it made my poops very, they were easy poops. So that was nice. Like, there was no straining needed for these poops. But I found that they were really messy and sticky, and I had to wipe a lot extra compared to what I would normally do. And I was finding with glucomannan, I was having like one giant log every day, and I would be completely evacuated and, you know, kind of like, all right, my work is done. With PHGG, I noticed that I was having many small to medium-sized sticky poops each day. So instead of having one nice, well-formed log, I was having these like sticky, slightly looser poops, and I was having like 3 or 4 of them per day, which was really annoying because then, like I said, I had to wipe extra. So then that's like kind of a pain in the ass, pun intended. So, pardon me. So I did not like the experience of taking PHGG. Now, again, I don't have anything wrong with me, so that's probably why. I'm basically treating something that's not there. But that was my personal, like, symptomatic experience taking PHGG, just for what it's worth. By the way, now that we're at the end of the video, I could tell you, I'm sorry I've been clearing my throat a bit more recently in this video. I just had COVID, like, last week. And I'm about 9 days post exhibiting any symptoms. I'm like 99.5% better, but clearly I still have a little bit of lingering phlegm and a little bit of a lingering cough. So sorry that I've been clearing my throat in this video, but I really wanted to get this video done. So I decided to just bite the bullet and do it despite my voice being not perfect. So hopefully that's all right. Hopefully I don't get any rude comments that my voice sounds gross today, because I'll just laugh. But I really wanted to record this video last week, and then I developed symptoms on Monday of last week, and I wasn't able to do any recording. So I really wanted to get this ready for you today. Sorry, not sorry about sounding a little bit cruddy. Luckily, COVID wasn't a super big deal for my family, and we all got out pretty much unscathed, but it delayed my recording schedule, and I really wanted to do this video. So that's why I sound just a tiny bit gross. But thank you guys for tuning in. As always, I will see you in the next video. I will say I have another data set to share before this version of the experiment wraps up, because I did go ahead and do the 2FL Holy Ghost experiment as well. So I'll do a video on that coming up. And then, like I said, I'm going to scrap it. I'm going to start collecting data probably in the next month or so. But also because I had COVID, I was taking turmeric and sulforaphane and some probiotics, and I was taking things that altered my microbiome when I was sick. So I have to give myself a couple of weeks to really reestablish a baseline before I start collecting again. So I'll probably squeeze in one more video towards the end of this year, or maybe in January, and then it'll be 2023 before we know it. And I'm very excited for sharing some more exciting stool test results and this channel. One of my upcoming videos is going to be a big old expose on a lot of your favorite stool test. I'm not going to name names yet, but I have some data pouring in from some volunteers, and it is damning. And I can't wait to bring that video. Yeah, I'm going to rock the stool testing world one way or another with these experiments. But I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.